This time on Film Record, we are talking about Peter Jackson. The Kiwi director has so far made 13 films, with almost half of those being set in Middle-earth. He is known for industry-leading effects, big productions, and hefty runtimes. He's one of the highest-grossing directors of all time, but it hasn't always been smooth sailing, so let's take a look at his films and count them down. Number 13, Lovely Bones. Lovely Bones is generally Jackson's worst reviewed film, which is fair, but also kind of complex. In Jackson's defense, it has terrific visuals, but it gets bogged down in the effects at the expense of the story. It's an example of the kind of misfire that could only be made by a talented director. In the end, what is meant to be kind of the spiritual successor to Heavenly Creatures comes off more like a poor man's M. Night Shyamalan. The one big standout is Stanley Tucci, who's practically made a career of great performances in not-so-great films. Number 12, The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies. The Hobbit films could have been solid if they were two 90-minute to 2-hour movies, but as a trilogy of 3-plus-hour epics, they don't really work, and this final chunk is the biggest culprit. The SMAUG stuff's good, though it should have been in the film before this. The rest of it, however, is 3 hours of film for what's really just one short chapter of the book, and even then it only kind of follows that text. It's beautifully shot, but the entire film could have been cut into 30 minutes and not much would have been lost. Number 11, Bad Taste. I get it if you love Bad Taste. I kind of do as well. If you're a Peter Jackson fan and you haven't seen it, go find it. But it really is a first film in that kind of messing around with your friends and a $50 camcorder kind of way. Although, with some pretty cool DIY effects. The sound's awful, the plot is insane, the acting's atrocious, but all of that is part of its charm. It's certainly a fun film. It's just hard to argue that it's a particularly well-made one. Number 10, Meet the Feebles. Long before Avenue Q gave us a potty-mouthed Sesame Street, there was this film about an extremely sexed-up version of the Muppets. It's fun in a teenage sense of humor kind of way, and the puppets are grotesquely great, especially the evil show producer Walrus and the adorable out-of-his-depth hedgehog. It's a bit dark, both literally and metaphorically, and the joke does get a bit thin by the end, but it's worth watching for the debauched craziness. Number 9, The Hobbit, The Desolation of SMAUG. Of the 3 Hobbit films, this one has many of the best scenes. The barrel escape's great, Bard's a terrific character, the spiders are legitimately scary, and the SMAUG reveal is really compelling. The real problem is the cliffhanger ending, which is unforgivable, especially when the title promises the exact thing that the film cuts out and then saves it for part 3. If you want to leave us hanging, call it the anticlimactic flying of SMAUG or the preemptive grumpiness of SMAUG. With some hardy editing and the SMAUG payoff, this could have been the highlight of the series. Number 8, BRAINDEAD. Known as Dead Alive in the US, this was Jackson's first small step into the mainstream. It has a bit of that classic zombie DIY aesthetic like Evil Dead or the early George Romero films, with more than a bit of that cheeky Kiwi humor to go along with it. This is the film that coined the phrase splat stick, which is a perfect description of the gore comedy mashup. Some bits do overstay their welcome, and it never reaches the Sam Raimi, Bruce Campbell heights it's aiming for, but it's a charmingly gross indie film. Number 7, The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey. It certainly suffers from the same bloat problems as the other two, but the first of the Hobbit films has a lot more going for it than people give it credit for. There are echoes of the charm we saw in Fellowship of the Rings and a nice exploration of some new corners of the world and new characters, as well as some fun callbacks or call forwards to the characters and places we already know. With an hour chopped out of it, this could have been a great setup for the series. Number 6, King Kong. It may not be the best version of King Kong, but it certainly is the most thorough, and there's a lot of great stuff in here. Peter Jackson's King Kong feels a little bit like binging a mini-series. It's a very clear 3-act structure, with each act being so defined that it feels kind of like its own thing. The island has some great effects and cool scenes, and Kyle Chandler is a real standout in the cast, but does feel a bit long, and we don't always connect to the characters in the way we're supposed to, but there are more pluses than minuses here. Number 5, The Frighteners. This is the first of Peter Jackson's clear top 5. It didn't do well in theaters, largely because it lives in a weird gray area between adult and kids, but for people who grew up with Ghostbusters but appreciate the harder edges, it's a cult favorite. Michael J. Fox is always amazing, the effects are super effective, and the ultra dark humor works well for the right audience. If you saw it, you probably liked it. If you missed it, go find it. Number 4, Heavenly Creatures. This is the movie that really got Peter Jackson noticed by the world. Based on a true story of teenage girls turned murderers, it's an interesting blend of fantasy and reality and features an eye-opening debut performance from Kate Winslet, as well as an underrated performance from Melanie Lynskey. It is the most subdued and grounded thing that Jackson has ever done, and it stands up surprisingly well 25 years later. Number 3, Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. It's kind of questionable to separate the 3 Lord of the Rings films given how they were filmed. Even the Oscar that this one won is generally agreed to be for the series as a whole. Return of the King is a killer finale. It wraps everything up neatly, has some great battle scenes, and really does deliver. So why is it third? Well, it drags a little bit in the end with what feels like half a dozen closing scenes, and the epic battles don't quite reach the heights of Helm's Deep. It's fantastic, though. It's just a 9.9 instead of a clear-cut 10. Number 2, Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. I go back and forth on these top 2. Two Towers generally falls to the bottom for folks because it's the middle child. It doesn't set it up and it doesn't end it, but it also has the toughest job as it needs to carry on the meat of the story, and it does that exceptionally well. The Battle of Helm's Deep really is phenomenal. It's an eye-popping set piece like no other. Two Towers also does a great job exploring more of the world and getting everything in place for the finale. It does a lot of the work, and it does it really effectively. Number 1, Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring. The hopes for this were sky high, and it overachieved in every possible way. Right from the opening credits, the audience is hooked, and the journey that follows is truly epic. The Shire, the Mines of Moria, Rivendell, it's all so fully formed, as are the characters who really do make a fellowship. There are too many memorable scenes to run through. Peter Jackson gets a lot of well-earned flack for his lengthy films, but Fellowship doesn't just warrant every minute of its runtime, it leaves audiences begging for another 6 hours. And that is it. Let me know what you think in the comments. Are you a fan of the early gore films? Do you think I'm maybe too hard on The Hobbit or maybe too easy? Either way, please do like and subscribe, and hopefully I will see you all next time for another film.